as well as a firefighting side. I want to cover several subjects during our time together this morning, and because of the time, it's going to be a overview of a lot of things, not a real deep dive into systems and devices. As illustrated by recent incidents in New England, fire incidents occur on a regular basis in lodging properties. We've had a number of lessons learned over the years, however. So over time, the frequency and severity of incidents in the lodging industry has been reduced, frankly. It's not eliminated. We have to work at fire safety on a regular basis. It's not ever solved. It requires discipline. And hopefully today you'll see how the pieces of what can be a confusing puzzle can mesh together with you. To start, I want to frame the subject, covering some history, coupled to a brief review of stats and historic trends. Again, there's a story that's out there that is often lost as time goes by, but the industry has traveled a challenging path over the many decades and met the challenges. I want to shift gears to a review of what a fire is, particularly what a room or compartment fire looks like. It's not what you see or you think from the movies or television shows. Physically, it's just very hard to film. Chicago fire and backdraft impart some idea of the sense of timing, but you don't get a real idea of the physical challenge that's out there. Then I want to turn to your facilities and talk about the need for a good self-assessment. If you're on this call today, you're interested in the subject, and I hope you'll go back to your facility or facilities and do a good self-assessment of where you are, where your program is. The first thing we start with is hazard and fire prevention, basically. We want to prevent things.
Byron,
Yes,
excuse me. I didn't know, maybe I'm incorrect, but I thought I just mentioned to you that, do you need to advance your slide? Because we're still on the first slide.
Yeah, I'm going to advance in just 1 second here.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, nope. Anyway, we're going to touch on fire hazard abatement and then get into a review of systems. So one thing I think is very important, and whether we're doing brand standards for a large firm or just a small organization, you want to have a sense of what your fire safety goals are. I'm going to touch on this at the end, but here are some that are common discussions with clients we've had. Clearly, we want to prevent, to the extent possible, emergency incidents. It's not realistic to say you're going to prevent all of them. You have to be ready for an emergency incident, but our goal is prevention. Life safety of our building occupants, guests, employees, service personnel, that's paramount as well. Code and regulatory compliance, a legal obligation that your firms have, that's there as well. That doesn't always align with what is a fire safe facility. You occupy a building with a certificate of occupancy, and then you operate under a fire code. And not all the time does the code see what your challenges are. You might have some unique preservation issues. You have general property requirements that you say your insurance company has. You might be on a unique site. I know I'm here in coastal South Carolina, and there are places along here, and I assume also in Maine, where a building site can be used. If you lose the building through a hurricane, a flood, a fire, you can no longer replace that. So that may be a unique consideration that you have to take into account. Community considerations, how this is that sort of larger stakeholder view that people are getting into these days, and then reputational concerns for your firms. So going back a little bit in time, there really was a sea change in the United States in terms of fire safety and what we call the built environment. In the 60s and early 70s, there were some extremely large fires. Good example was the original McCormick Place in Chicago that burned to the ground. High-rise fires, just a large amount of fire incidents that kept the country back from really having a flexible built environment. There was a presidential commission in 1971 National Commission on Fire Prevention and Control. They released a study in 1973 that's somewhat noted in at least the fire community, that led to creation of things like the U.S. Fire Administration, the U.S. Fire Academy in Emmitsburg, Maryland, the National Fire Incident Reporting System, or INFRS, and the Center for Fire Research. Some of the information I'm presenting today is a direct result of those organizations. One noted number, or two numbers that were in the report. In 1973, and for several years before that, the National Fire Protection Association, year in and year out, said we had 12,000 fire fatalities and 300,000 injuries per year. That turned out to not be quite correct. We probably, in about 1973, we had more like 8,000 fatalities. The INFR system, reporting system statistics became much more accurate. There's still estimates, but we have a much better handle over the 4 decades of the numbers of fires per year, our fatalities, property estimate loss. On the left, in figure 2, that's the civilian fire deaths per year. In 1980, 6,500 was probably a reasonably accurate number. Today, 3,500, a much more reasonably accurate number. So we have traveled a long distance from the 12,000 inaccurate number of the 70s till now. We have a pretty good handle, not entirely accurate, but a better handle on fire losses. The right side gives you a sense of the property loss per year. The right side of the screen is skewed pretty heavily with Western fire incidents, these large wildfires that occur. On a population basis, and this is important as we'll get into the lodging industry in the next slide. So these slides correct for the change in population. So on a per capita basis, total fires, home fires, things have gone down considerably over the years, fire deaths included on a per million basis. Lodging industry, I don't have a slide for this. If you think about the number of hotel rooms that have been added to the inventory in the United States, particularly over the last several decades, our fire loss records are considerably lower than they were pre, let's just take 1980 as a year. Hotels at one point were carried as a separate entity for the National Fire Protection Association statistics. Now they're just since the mid-1990s, they're just carried under other residential, which our deaths are a small percentage of the overall fatalities in the country. So you can see that our major problems fire-wise in terms of fatalities in the country are residential. 1 and 2 family homes, apartments, then followed by highway deaths. Those occupy the largest part of our casualties. Again, we're not eliminating fires, but vis-a-vis hotels, we've traveled a long distance. There's not a lot of great statistics on lodging fire incidents, but I think we've finally settled on, over the years, going from about 12,000 reported fires. Now, these are not all fires, these are reported fires. The U.S. Fire Administration published a paper in 2018 for the years 2014 to 2016, and we seem to have settled at around 3,900 incidents a year. That's still over 10 a day. I get a Google search, which I get hits on regularly per week, on fire in hotels and CO in hotels, and we do have a regular drumbeat of incidents, as you've witnessed in New England over the last several months. They're there. They occur, just with less frequency, and certainly with less severity in terms of life loss. The industry between the 1930s and the 1980s experienced some hellacious fires with very large life loss. The property I have up here is the infamous Weinkauf Hotel. The fire incident occurred in 1946 and resulted in 119 dead. It's the largest hotel fire in the history of the United States. But that same year, previously in the year, there were 2 other fires, one in Chicago at the LaSalle, where 61 people were killed, and at a hotel, the Hotel Canfield in Dubuque, Iowa, where 19 were killed. for a total in just 3 fires in 1946 of nearly 200 people dead in hotels. The 1980s, again, I want to make that year sort of our crossroads for a number of reasons. We've already, in the 70s, we began to see it fire in a little bit different way, and a lot of resources were being applied to it. But the hotel industry suffered some very serious fires. The MGM Grand is well known in 1980, but also the Stouffer's Inn fire. I believe this property is now operated as a Marriott in Westchester, New York. There were 26 fatalities. Hilton had several fires in about an 18-month period of time in 1981 and 82, in which 24 folks were killed. But along the way, things were beginning, resources were beginning to be applied to the problem. In 1987 still, we had the DuPont Plaza fire, which I think is the second deadliest in American history, with 98 fatalities. So what changed? And let me point out, Las Vegas Hilton and the DuPont Plaza were arson fires, which is a tough challenge to anticipate, but possible to. Well, I'll say change came from at least two arenas. One was from the technical. Again, we're learning more about fire. We have more equipment and systems, and then a societal change where we get to this 24-hour news cycle. Fires were happening for decades before. But in 1980, we start the so-called 24-hour news cycle. We have a big penetration of homes with CNN, other news channels, and now we segue to the internet where things happen instantaneously. When I check out of a hotel, I'm surveyed within a matter of hours. Most of the time, people are looking for comments to be put on TripAdvisor or some other things. So we consume information at a breakneck pace versus pre-1980, the 1980s, and now. So that gives a little bit of background. The industry had some very significant challenges, and over time, tools have been devised, systems have been devised, equipment has been provided that give you the ability to manage fire safety, not solve it, but manage it. So switching gears, I'd like to talk about fire, just what is a fire? It's, again, not what you see in Hollywood or on television shows. This is an illustration of a basic compartment fire. We have some level of fuel. We have an air supply. Fire growth is dictated somewhat by the air and by the ignition source and fuel. Compartment geometry matters a lot. A small compartment, your fire growth will probably be quicker than, say, in an atrium of a hotel. Compartment materials matter. The plywood, the drywall, the ceiling materials, doors and windows, whether they're opened or closed. Fire detection. If we intervene early in a fire, we don't have as extreme a problem as we might otherwise have. Manual intervention early in a fire matters. If we're catching it small, we don't have the large incident. Automatic intervention from, say, a fire sprinkler system, that matters as well. So these are important, just a basic idea of what's happening in a fire. You've got smoke, hot gases evolving in the room and creating a very unsafe environment unless there's an intervention. I want to use as an example, I'm just going to play this briefly. Many of you know of the Station Nightclub fire, which occurred in 2003 in Rhode Island. It was a tragic fire. One unique aspect of that is a video survived from that fire that gives a sense of the very ultra-fast fire evolving. This is not typical of what you'd see, but it gives you in a very short period of time a thought about how a fire actually works. I'm only going to play the first minute 30 because then I want to show a simulation that was developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology that gives an idea of what actually occurs. So this is the opening sequence. A band is started. There's fireworks involved. and there is sheathing with expanded foam insulation around the stage. So a critical time happens right. I want to stop at about 25 or 30 seconds into it to give you an idea how quickly this incident occurred. At this point, the fireworks has started. The combustibles that are adjacent to it, and it's going to go very quickly. And the videographer, thankfully, along with a lot of other people, react to it very quickly and start backing out of the room. And it'll just give a very, very graphic sense of what happens in a building fire, in a compartment fire. We go from very quickly here from a single item of combustibles being consumed, adjacent combustibles. You begin this sort of chain reaction of the room being involved in fire, getting to a state that we call flashover. You've probably heard that before, and that's a very important state. At that point of flashover, a compartment or most of it is really in is fully involved and is an extremely dangerous situation. So I'm going to stop it here. The rest of the video is fairly graphic. We've covered this in some of the, and I should say, I've done this in a number of settings for a number of folks. And we delve into this very deeply in terms of taking the fire apart. But the next thing I want to show is what National Institute of Standards and Technology did, just a comparison of the fire development. So you can see this in a little less, it's not the real environment, but you can see the fire growth in the room. Watch how we go from two distinct points of fire to flashover conditions in a little over a minute. We're going to cover automatic sprinklers a little bit later, but this is an important time. At 26 or so seconds, one sprinkler goes off. A little later, a second sprinkler goes off. Just note the difference in conditions within that compartment now in a sprinkler intervention versus non-intervention. And watch that smoke layer. Above that smoke layer is they're just hot gases, flame. It's just not a survivable environment. If you were a firefighter properly equipped down on the floor at this point, this is still a dangerous situation. But this is the way, again, a fire develops. Just watch that smoke and heat layer descend rapidly in the compartment versus the sprinkler situation. That's not a particularly healthy environment, but you can survive it and get out of the room or building. So I just want to recap. At this point, we're just covering some history, and that's what a fire looks like. And now I want to turn to your facilities and what you can do to manage your fire challenges. Step one, I would recommend a rigorous self-assessment of your facility or facilities. Be very honest with what you've got in terms of physical systems, plans, programs. This is the time to really look carefully at what you have. So here's a self-assessment, sort of quick checklist. What are your existing assets? Do you have a fire and hazard prevention plan? Is it in place? Is it used? Is it accurate for your facilities? Do you have protective systems that are appropriate for the hazards, fire hazards, etc.? Are there emergency plans in place? Do you have employee training? What's your relationship with emergency responders, such as your fire department? Meeting the fire chief in the porte-cochere of your hotel at the time of the incident is not a good strategy. Know them before, pre-plan with them, let them be familiar with your facilities. Existing conditions, plans and training, appropriate, up to date. You can read the rest. Inspection, testing, and maintenance. That's both for internal staff and external contractors. ITM, or inspection, testing, and maintenance, is a really key part of continuing fire safety. It's year in and year out. protecting the assets that you have. So we get to fire hazard prevention. These are the key elements, I believe, of a fire prevention program. This is pretty much nuts and bolts, probably not a lot of mystery here, but it has to be done. A lot of times general housekeeping is the last on the list, but I put it first because I think a clutter-free building with unneeded combustibles removed is an important subliminal message that you're sending to staff and your employees. Keeping unneeded combustibles down is a first step. Electrical safety. What's the equipment condition? If you have abandoned equipment and wiring, I was just in a hotel a few weeks ago, and I think they had all the wiring and all the equipment that was there since it was built in 1980. They had abandoned a lot of things in place, and as part of a PIP, no one could really understand what was going on in their storage areas, which were cluttered, and the appearance was of an unsafe environment. In actuality, it was overstuffed with combustibles. A lot of the abandoned wiring looked unsafe, but it didn't have power to it, but it just didn't look that way. C is very important. Employ licensed and experienced service personnel, whether that's electrical equipment or mechanical equipment. Be sure that you're using people that understand your equipment. This is not a time to get discount services. And conduct regular inspection of electrical equipment. Switchgear, particularly, if you've got large equipment, maybe consider infrared analysis from time to time. Very key in terms of electrical safety. In the hotel industry, I put down ignition source control. And ignition sources can come from a number of areas, but three particular. What's your policy for use of candles? When boutique hotels started, it seemed like as I was going around, everybody had candles. That was part of the atmosphere. Be very careful with candles. Smoking controls. We're not smoking a lot anymore. Most of you have a notice to guests, if you smoke in the room, there's going to be a cleaning charge. That's good. That has prevented a lot of smoking-related incidents in rooms, guest rooms. I ran across an interesting fire a few weeks ago, however, where a smoking area had been created outside of the main entrance, and somehow the smoking materials, discarded smoking materials, were able to penetrate an exterior wall and start a fire in a shaft that went north three floors. Very unusual fire. It was in Central Virginia. The local fire department had to open all the walls for 3 floors to extinguish the fire. The facility was shut down for a while. So smoking controls in rooms are one thing. Where you allow smoking and how smoking materials are handled is important as well. Hot work controls, anything from sweating a pipe to major welding, you need to have hot work controls in place. Cooking hazards. Kitchen, to me, is the Achilles heel of most lodging operations. This is where you're handling hot grease. You're handling just basically cooking equipment where you turn gas on, gas off. Greg passed along to me a fire incident that occurred in your state recently with a pot that was left on overnight and caused a fire incident that I would say I had not seen anything like that in the past. So very, very, very unusual. But you just have to have general cooking safety in the kitchen and pay special attention to fryers. We're going to get back to this in our fire suppression. But anywhere where you've got grease-laden vapors, those vapors are going to condense on cold surfaces, so you have to have strong cleaning practices in place. Fireplaces, chimneys and flue inspection. Hazardous materials such as flammable liquids and combustibles. How are those handled, hopefully safely? Arson prevention. Again, a couple large fires, we had arson incidents. We had recently had a fire in Buffalo, New York, of a hotel that was under construction, under renovation, with a fairly major arson incident that was reported in the local news. And most of the time, in any of these incidents I'm reporting on, I'm reading news summaries. I'm not typically reading a detailed technical summary, but it seemed reasonable in the news, and that Buffalo incident caused several $1 million. Security plays a huge role in arson prevention. Lighting, access controls, those go hand in hand. I don't mean to cut short security today, but we don't have a lot of time. But a lot of this meshes together in terms of fire safety efforts and general security and safety. Fuel burning equipment, carbon monoxide, we'll talk about this a little bit more, and your unique fuel gas rule in Maine. Always use licensed and experienced service personnel and regularly inspect your equipment. Carbon monoxide is a deadly killer. We have regular incidents. I think many of you probably heard of the incident in Bahamas recently with 3 dead, likely from carbon monoxide. A month or so before that, there was an incident in Kentucky with 2 dead. A week before that, there were 9 people injured from carbon monoxide at a pool at a hotel in Ohio. Hardly anybody heard about those incidents. So the nexus of these typically are the fuel-fired equipment, and a lot of times the equipment has either failed, which can be uncovered in an inspection, or it's been serviced by personnel that are not experienced with the equipment. So key elements there of fire and carbon monoxide safety: use good service personnel and inspect. Turn the employees that you have into the eyes and ears of the hotel. Employee awareness of what you're doing and the importance you place on it is key. They are out there, particularly your housekeeping staff and engineers. They're in and out of rooms and spaces every day. You're not. So let's turn to the step 3. Let's look at the systems that we have in place, that you may have some of these or all of these in your properties. But I want to just get you to see, if I can, that these elements, some are systems, the first one is not, but they all wrap up into a fire strategy where they assist each other in a comprehensive strategy to deal with fire safety. Before I get to the systems, our general response to a fire is detection. If we see it early, we use our human senses to act to a fire and react to it, we're going to catch it, hopefully catch it at an early stage. We provide automatic detection to back up our human senses, particularly in areas where we're not always in place, or in the hotel industry, we have guests that are not familiar with your building. They are not going to know necessarily always how to react. So automatic detection backs up the human senses. In our alert and alarm stage, our data that I showed earlier are reported fires. We know we have a lot more in the way of fire incidents. It just gets handled early on. Someone sees it, they either act on their own or they tell people about it, and it's taken care of. But we also have automatic methods through fire alarm systems and fire protection devices, that gives us the alert. Our emergency response to the fire: if we're proximate to the fire, we can perhaps use a fire extinguisher to handle it, or call on the local resources such as the fire department. And we get to finally suppression and incident control. A friend of mine is, I think Dennis has been a fire chief for about 400 years. He talks about this response to fire as managing chaos. And that's really what it is. In any emergency, we start with something that is confusing, chaotic, and we manage it to a non-chaotic state. And the key is to catch it early when chaos is minimized. All right, so let's turn to our features. First one I have up in that circle that's not a system, but it's your fire-rated construction features. These are fire walls and partitions, fire doors. In the hotel industry, I think a very overlooked mechanism is the door closer on a guest room door. Again, our compartment fire, if we keep it in the compartment, that is a quantum difference between the fire entering a guest quarter, for example. Those are two entirely different incidents. Once you get a quarter involved, we've taken away means of egress, the fire grows. So the door closer is a really, really, really important mechanism. NFPA 80 is the National Fire Protection Standard that covers fire doors and equipment. And it actually imparts an annual inspection obligation on the owner of a building. I think it's more honored in breach than it actually is honored, but it is an important concept that at least annually you look at those doors and those closers, that they close and they latch. Major, major, major way to preserve compartment integrity. Our fire detection and alarm systems. Anymore, our modern systems, and this has grown out of the developments we've had over the last few decades, both in the fire industry and in computing capabilities, they're microprocessor based. Even a small system, if it's up to date, you're going to be using a chip somewhere that's managing. It's no longer a mechanical system. They're intelligent. They can tell what's going on in a building. They can tell that a smoke detector at a given location is activated. I just did a community project here on our island. We have a small system in the building. It has about 10 smoke detectors. When I go to the panel, it's always been in test so far. When I go to the panel, I know when that smoke detector is being tested in a given location. It tells me right on the panel in graphics. A word here, I've got a simplex panel and a notifier panel up here. I'm a consultant. I'm neutral on suppliers, so that's why I've got two up there. The graphic that I show there just kind of gives you an idea. In a building, you have the fire alarm control unit. They're pulling from devices and then communicating to devices. Essentially, your fire alarm system is processing input signals. They can be from what we call initiation devices, smoke detectors, heat detectors, a CO detector, a water flow detector. They contain wiring, and they're supervised. In other words, the system can tell when there is a fault, when there is a trouble signal, when there's a supervisory signal. They don't just send fire alarms, they also manage themselves. Let's talk about the difference between system smoke detectors and smoke alarms. A system smoke detector, again, back on a system, is integral to that system connected to the central processing unit. In the case of a hotel, you're going to see a sounder base installed on system smoke detectors used in guest rooms, maybe a few other places. But typically, you just have a sensor communicating back to the control unit. A local smoke alarm, and this is a depiction of a newer model with a 10-year permanent battery. We've moved now towards just simply replacing the system the unit every 10 years, not the battery. But that's a local system. These can be interconnected to a limited number, but they're not generally communicating to a central location. If that alarm goes off in a room, it's going to alarm in the local area, say a guest room in a remote corridor. Picture that. If that's the only device in the area, how is the hotel staff going to learn about it? We do use smoke alarms to a great extent, coupled to automatic sprinkler protection. In that way, if the fire grows to a certain extent, the sprinkler system is going to give us an alarm. Carbon monoxide alarms, they can be combined with smoke detectors, but again, we have system versus discrete units. I want to turn to Greg here. This is an interesting rule that I've never seen before, except for Maine. When I started to talk with him, talk about your new fuel gas detection rule that just came into effect in January, Greg. If I could turn to you for your comments at this point, I think they'd be welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Byron. And it's unfortunate that I have to report this, but actually LD 346 was put into the last session in response to the Farmington disaster, where a building filled with gas and exploded, and a fireman was killed, and several others were injured, one very severely. So there was a lot of emotion as it related to this particular thing. And as you can see on Byron's slide, the A, B, C, D, and F went into effect January 1 of 2022. And so, excuse me, A, B, C, D, and E. E is a mixed-use occupancy that contains a dwelling unit. So if you have a convenience store that you cook in, or you have a restaurant with an apartment above it, then you would be required to be doing this as well. It would also reflect, sometimes we have dwelling units or hotel rooms in rooms above in a separate building above a cooking area, those would also have to already have the gas detectors put in. F, G, and H, business occupancy, which includes restaurants, would not go into effect until 1/1/2026. So from the information provided by the State Fire Marshal's Office, some important pieces: fuel gas detectors are not the same as carbon monoxide detectors and will not replace the need for those within buildings in Maine. Fuel gas detectors may be powered, and this is something we asked to have in there, by any of the following methods: battery, plugged into an electrical outlet, or hardwired. I know a lot of people say, well, I don't do the battery ones because people just take them. However, we also didn't want people to fall into a situation where they had to hardwire everything, especially since everything probably was already hardwired. And then the last piece from them is the fuel gas detectors will only be required to be placed within the room where a propane, natural gas, or liquefied petroleum gas fueled appliance is located. That isn't technically true. This is be careful what you wish for, and maybe I've never seen this happen before, but there was an amendment to this bill that changed the dates for F, G, and H to 2026, and also changed the word fuel to combusts. So technically, and I have information from the State Fire Marshal's Office that backs this up, that you only need a gas detector in a room where there is a gas appliance that combusts. So if you have a gas furnace and you're heating 30 rooms with vents, no need for gas detectors. If you have 30 rooms and you have gas fireplaces in all 30 rooms, then you would need a gas detector in each of the rooms. The other thing that I get a lot of discussion from people, or questions actually from people in our membership, is who's responsible for this. The State Fire Marshal's Office got involved in helping to write the law. There was also a fire suppression specialist who was actually a committee member, if you can believe that one or not. And they sort of worked together to do it, but the State Fire Marshal's Office takes no responsibility for this at all, nor does the Maine Fuel Board, and it says so right on their website. And so technically, the people who are responsible for enforcing this are the local code enforcement officer, or if your community has a life safety inspector in the fire department, it would be that individual. Sometimes the CEO is the life safety inspector as well. So I have backup for all of this. I keep checking Maine statute to see if the clerk forgot to send the amendment to the revisor's office. So the law was put up as the original proposed bill. It doesn't have the 2026 dates, and it doesn't talk about the combustion point. Though I check it every day, including today, and it's still not fixed. But of course, a lot of laws were passed, and there's a lot of work that goes on till the end of July to get them up on their site. So if you run into any problems at all, don't hesitate to email me. I can send you the backup info. I have everything that was ever given to me. Byron, sorry it took so long.
It's okay. It's a unique rule. I've never seen this across the country. I've done fire alarm updates and worked across the country. I've not seen it. It's a very unique rule. Let's turn to fire suppression. Our common tool is a fire sprinkler system. This just illustrates the basic components of the sprinklers. You see a couple examples, one operating, one a flush sprinkler. You have control modules, water supply, pumps in this case. A lot of times you'll have a simple connection to a municipal system. This is a little more complicated. But one key thing are these boxes here on these floor assemblies, and those are the interfaces, the water flow switches that go back to the fire alarm system. That's important. That's what gives us comprehensive protection with the sprinkler system. Maine has an interesting policy. This is, I'm just going to quickly show this. We can have afterwards we can supply some information. You can find the link at the State Fire Marshal's Office, allowing, or at least acknowledging, the temporary shutdown, a seasonal shutdown of systems. I think throughout history, whether it's in Maine, I know in Michigan it's happened, where seasonal buildings are lost while they're shut down and the systems are shut off. So be very careful with that. Here's a policy from the Maine Fire Marshal on it, and we'll give you the link to it. Our kitchen hoods, we've talked about this briefly. This is a very, very challenging area of a hotel. You've got combustible grease and fats. They generate grease-laden vapors. The fires are fast developing with a high release rate. Basically, you need a UL 300 rated wet chemical fire extinguishing system backed up with Class K fire extinguishers. You've got to have good cleaning of the ducts. Don't skimp on this. I've had numerous fires that I've followed up from after the fact when regular cleaning hasn't been followed. Don't overlook portable fire extinguishers. I keep a water-based 2.5 gallon can in my closet. Water-based, the ABC units are multi-class, and then Class K for kitchens. Employee training is a must, however. Means of egress. This is a very short conversation we're having today. Means of egress can get very complicated, but let me give you 5 simple things that you can look at in your facilities. Look for 2 ways out. We don't want to rely upon one point to save a guest's life, for instance. Remember, you have people in your buildings that aren't familiar. You need to give them some options. Make sure the path of travel is storage free. Clutter, furnishings, etc. aren't there. Stairs and ramps in good physical condition. It's well marked. There's wayfinding capability and is illuminated on loss of power. So in your self-assessment, I'd suggest you select a remote location in your building and go to it, and then leave via a different path of travel. That's a common thing in fire, is that people backtrack where they came from because they're familiar. It'd be nice if they knew a second way in the event of a fire. We've had kind of crazy things over time that suggested we've had ramps, and there was a tube that somebody suggested for a slide for high-rise buildings. Clearly, parachutes and slides are not acceptable means of egress. You want to use stairs, ramps, familiar things, well lit, and backed up. Final sort of item in our fire strategy is emergency power. On loss of power, how is that transferred? What's the load on your generator, for example? What's the fuel capacity? If you anticipate a long outage, what's the refueling plan? And how well is that generator and all the controls protected from natural hazards and elements? So those are the 5 areas that we can look at in a strategy and try to mesh them together, from the built-in features to the systems to the backup power and lighting. They have to work hand in glove together to be effective. So sort of final topic is staff training and fire protection policies and procedures. This has to be followed. Inspection, testing, and maintenance is key. And very importantly, that your staff, in the event of an incident, have management skills and training. There's an accountability, particularly for hearing and mobility challenged folks. At a shift change, is there acknowledgement that you might have some mobility challenged guests in house? What are the alarm procedures? And then the interface with, say, for instance, the fire department. A quick war story. We're running out of time, but one of the first CO incidents I was aware of in a hotel was in Kentucky. And on a morning, this is when things were manual, front desk clerk was not getting responses to wake-up calls. And she very, very quickly concluded there was something wrong. She sounded the fire alarm, which brought the local fire department. They began to open doors. A pool heater had malfunctioned. They had people with significant CO issues in multiple rooms. 8 people were taken to the hospital. They all survived. That front desk clerk did her job that day and more. So that's important to have that meshing of your staff and their knowledge to work with your systems. So if I can, let me just conclude with that idea of establishing your fire safety goals. Think through this. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And again, the first 3, I think that's pretty much going to be on every client's list. After that, we get a little bit different in terms of property protection, how you insure things, how you protect things, what are your goals, historic preservation, and site considerations are unique often to particular locations and buildings. You may have other goals, but I strongly suggest that you think through, particularly as you start a self-assessment, what is it we're trying to accomplish? What are your goals by the undertaking that you seek to do? So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Greg. I'm going to stop sharing if that's okay, Greg, and you can take things back over.
Well, thank you very much, Byron. That was excellent. That was very informative, and certainly would like to entertain any questions. As I had mentioned earlier, if you have one, you must know the raise hand feature by now. Please feel free to do that, and we'll direct the question to Byron. Byron, just so you know, we had a similar sort of situation here in Maine, in Ogunquit, where somebody at the front desk actually determined that there was an issue with CO in the building and did call the fire department. And once again, a lot of people were saved. And kind of honestly, that kind of drove our CO monitor law here in the state of Maine. Much like the gas detector one was also caused by something that was pretty bad that occurred. So,
right. We tend to react to incidents, and the original incident is always somewhat tragic, but when we don't learn from them, in the case of your law, that's good. Case in Kentucky, same thing, but we still have them, and it's something to work at. Again, fire and all of this safety is never solved. It's just a discipline that we work in and day out.
And we also, we have a member on the call that I have been conversing with on this particular issue, looking for some sort of product that is CO, smoke, CO, and gas detector. I believe they do exist, and the issue has become they're expensive and could be hardwired and could cost a lot of money to install. So we're trying to find out if that type of unit is something that would be okay to be used in a hotel, and we have not received a response yet. We're pushing pretty hard to get it, but the traditional gas detectors are between $30 and $40 a piece.
Right.
And they are combo CO gas, but they just don't have the smoke feature as well.
Right. Yeah, I don't know of any with the gas feature to it. Combination CO smokes are very common. We just did as a pandemic hit, I should say, did a project in New York where we used combination units in every 500 rooms in a high-rise hotel. So they're there. They are expensive, but they do work. And keep in mind, when you say expensive, what's our life cycle of a building? That's where it's very important. I worked with several REITs. We were always asked, what's the 10-year plan? What's the 10-year plan? And so you cast out, what's the cost of this over a 10-year period? Your time frame may be different in your individual facility, but think about that. It may be a unit cost up front, but think about what's the cost over your time horizon.
Matthew, it looks like you have a question. So
yeah, thank you, Byron. I'm Matthew Levin. I'm up here in Camden, Maine. We've got 3 small boutique hotels, several of them in historic buildings. They're all sprinkled. But as in regards to the gas detectors, just our experience, we when we had our fire chief walk through last year, we had to, basically I was the one that actually informed him of this new law that was going into effect. And I had to send them the information. So the communication side of our state to our local fire chiefs is lacking. So that was the first step. The second is we scrambled to buy these devices, and we found, we didn't want to spend too much money on them, but we found on Amazon these $30 units. None could you find that were just battery operated. They had to be plug in with a battery backup. So what that does is that prevents you from, that limits you to where you can place these devices. And and several of them have distinct locations that they have to be located relative to the gas appliance in order for them to actually function properly if there's a leak. So that was your first challenge. So the first round of devices we bought started malfunctioning in several guest rooms and alarming the guests. And so we had to pull them all out because they were falsely going off. and guests thought they were carbon monoxide detectors, and we were trying to
Right.
convince them they were not. And and so we pulled them all out, and we wound up buying these Kidde combo CO and gas leak detectors. So we didn't find the triple play where it also did smoke, but we found a plug-in unit for $40 that was both carbon monoxide and the gas detector. So, so again, we spent all this money on every guest room, because every guest room of ours has a gas fireplace. So it sucked along the way. So we've got this whole
Right.
box of devices we're not using because they don't work. They falsely went off. And so now we're in a decent position with these new devices, but again, they're plugged into the nearest plug to the appliance. So it just shows you that, a lot of these laws that go into effect, and it's telling that you've never even heard of this before other than the state of Maine.
Right.
How kind of ridiculous this is, and how that there's no no device in place yet to satisfy the law,
And that's good to get some feedback to manufacturers. I think I'll be meeting over time with my connections at Siemens and Honeywell and all that. I'm absolutely going to inform them of this law.
Yeah.
I've just not run across it before. I'd hate to say that this is not something that's happened before, but particularly when CO was rolled out, and CO is a hazard, but to say that the industry was ready, coupled to the fire departments, that didn't happen. A lot of departments ran carbon monoxide detector false alarms that they didn't know what to do with them. They didn't have any procedures. People were confused. In a lodging property, if you hear an alarm, what's the guest to do? They don't live there. They don't really know. So I would recommend on your detectors, you might have a small note to say, this is what this is. And if you hear the alarm, here's the action we would like you to take. Leave the room, make a report, do whatever works for your plan. So it's not unusual to have that where the systems are just disconnected. There's a great deal of desire after particularly a tragic incident to do, quote, do something. And that do something sometimes doesn't always mesh with the reality of what's out there in the equipment environment, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So does anybody else have any questions at all? If not, we always like to give some time back. It's only 4 minutes, but I'm sure everyone can find something to do with it. Again, Byron, thank you for your time. Just so everybody knows, Byron's going to send the slide decks for the presentation, and we also recorded the meeting, so we'll be sharing that as well at some point. Kathleen will be sending that out. So thank you all very much for being here today, and take care.